Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Women in Whiskey charity tasting. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Women in Whiskey charity tasting. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've been to one of our virtual tastings before, welcome back. I'm Harry, and I run all the behind-the-scenes marketing and customer experience side of the Dram team. So you might notice that I'm a little bit different to our usual host, Chris. Chris is actually in the chat today, so he'll be able to help out with any questions and things in the comments section. So please say hello to Chris. I am really excited to step in front of the camera for once and give Chris a bit of a well-earned break from running these tastings. We've got a really special lineup for you today. I'm really excited about it. Not just have we got 6 really exciting whiskies to try, but I'll also be joined by 6 special guests from the whiskey world. So if you've had a look inside your box already, you might have had a sneak peek of who these people are. They all played a key part in the whiskies that we'll be tasting this evening in honor of International Women's Day, which was just this Monday. So I'm going to be inviting our guests onto the screen one at a time, just to taste through the whiskies in the box. So we'll run in the order from left to right. So if you wanted to start, grab your first dram if you like. If you haven't already poured it, that will be Tamnavulin. So we'll go through one at a time, and then at the end, I'm going to bring everyone back together. So for a little bit of a sort of informal Q&A. So if you've got any questions for them at that point, save them for the end if you like, or just pop them in the comments at any time, and we'll make sure we get to them. So make sure you've got your whiskey ready, you've got your drams ready, and let's kick off. So the other thing to mention as well is we've got the wonderful Vin from No Nonsense Whiskey, who's also he's been on quite a few of our tastings before. So Vin is going to be in the background helping me out. So I'll ask Vin if you can bring Laura on from Tamnavulin.
Hey, Harry.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I am not too bad. Yes, very excited. So Laura, you work for White & Mackay, who are the powerhouse behind Tamnavulin. So we've had a couple of Tamnavulin whiskies in our boxes before, but this is a new one for us. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the whiskey as well, if you could?
Absolutely, no problem at all. So I'm Communication and Media Relations Manager at White & Mackay. So I get to work across the whole portfolio. And the great thing about my job is that I actually get to work quite closely with the whiskey makers, including Tamnavulin. And as you mentioned, we featured Tamnavulin, I think, in your Whiskey and Wood box last year. And the reason that actually I've opted to choose Tamnavulin for this particular box is because a little known fact about Tamnavulin is it's led by women.
This is actually something I didn't know before you told me. So there's something they keep. They don't like to advertise that so much, do they?
No, but I have to say, so the two ladies that I'm talking about are Joanne Reevely, who's our distillery manager, and Samantha Douglas, who's our head brewer. And I have to say, they are pretty formidable as a force. They're a pretty powerhouse. Between the two of them, they've spent about 22 years in Speyside, which is obviously where Tamnavulin is. And they have a whole wealth of stories, particularly having spent the past 2 decades in the industry. As women in whiskey, they have an incredible number of stories about how the industry overall has actually changed.
Fascinating, yes. So how long have you yourself been with them then?
So for White & Mackay, I'm coming up for around about 2 years, but actually I've kind of been in the whiskey industry for the better part of 5 now. But way before that, right about when I was about 18 years old, I got a break and I ended up at London Fashion Week as a photographer. And from there, I worked on a number of editorial and celebrity features. But I suppose the transition into the whiskey world, I went into a more digital route, wasn't actually too much of a shock to the system, because fashion itself is actually quite a male-dominated industry. And actually, when I moved into the whiskey side of things, I actually found it to be an incredibly welcoming industry.
That's really good to hear, actually. Yeah. I have to say, I always felt the same way too. Having got into it myself through bartending, it was always, yeah, if you were passionate about something, people wanted to talk to you about it. So that, yeah, it's nice to hear. So that's quite a, let's say, an unconventional leap.
Yeah, totally.
Passion into whiskey. So tell us how that happened.
Well, it really started with, I decided that I wanted to go and do photography. Actually, interesting fact, Samantha, the head brewer that I was talking about, we actually did the same photography course, but at a totally different time. And then from there, yeah, very much started working in the kind of journalism side of things. I worked at the Bite magazine for a couple of years, and then from there, very much developed more of a kind of an affinity for digital as well. And then naturally, as I went agency side, I started to work more and more on some really great whiskey brands. And I met actually a lot of women in whiskey through that as well. Jacqueline McKee at Aaron Whiskey, I have a great deal of respect for because she kind of introduced me to that side of the world of whiskey.
Amazing, cool. You've got quite a cool story about a whiskey that's quite close to your heart as well. Can you tell us about that? I know you've told me before, but I'd love to share it.
Is that this with my dad?
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, with White and Mackay, as the 2 years have progressed, I've actually found that it's a brand that seems to touch a lot of people in terms of their families, and everybody kind of always seems to have a story of being connected. So my dad is a massive fan of Jura, so he introduced me to my first ever whiskey, which was a Jura. I think it was a Jura Origin at the time, way back in the old range, and that love really has stayed with me since. But I've actually found out since then that my uncle had worked at a Jura distillery as an engineer at one point, and my dad was taught by the Pipe Band Major of Invergordon Distillery. Endless.
That's really cool to hear. Yeah, amazing. Great. Well, I suppose, shall we taste the whiskey? I mean, this
absolutely.
What we're all here for. Should we get stuck into the first one? So, what do we have? What do you have for us today?
So we have a Tamnaville double cask. So I've got the full-size bottle here. Basically, this was the first release. So Tamnaville was largely a silent distillery, and then it kind of woke up a couple of years ago. And from that point on, we've had Tamnaville double cask, which is readily available in most supermarkets. You might see also some interesting finishes, red wine finishes, sherry cask finishes, sherry cask being in the previous box. And it's just a really good, accessible whiskey. It's a typical Speyside. It does have an element of sherry influence there as well. It's very sweet. It's quite light, but it's also quite full-bodied. So this one's bottled at 40%. It's kind of around about a price point of £22 to £22 when it's on offer. And I loved what Vin said, actually. The last time when he tasted the sherry cask, he referred to it as being like a guard whiskey. And I think that's a great way to describe this whiskey. It's the one that you'll put at the front of your home bar because you want to protect that single cask, or you maybe that 28-year-old at the back of the bar. And it's the one that you want to give to your friends, though, because you know it stands up to the scrutiny. And it's super, super tasty. I love it with dark chocolate.
Amazing. I have to say, I really love that description as well of guard whiskey that came out last time, and I think for those that haven't heard it, it was new to me at the time as well, and I really like that. So here's to the guard whiskey. Let's give this a taste. Tell us what you taste as well in this. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. So I'll give it a little nose first. So I always get that kind of initial vanilla note. So the whiskey itself, it's initially matured in American ex-bourbon oak barrels, and then it's finished in sherry casks. So you'll get a lot of that kind of vanilla, a little bit of toffee, sometimes maybe a little bit of clotted cream there, but also maybe some orchard fruits as well. What are you getting?
Lots of that sweetness up front. Yeah, totally. Quite desserty.
Yeah, absolutely. Now give it a little taste. So this is the thing about Tamnaville, and despite it being at 40%, which makes it a great daily sipper, it's something that I often have as a weeknight. It's not too heavy after a meal. But what I do find is it carries the flavour well. So I get like a lot of maybe brown sugar there, a little bit more of that ice cream, some peaches, maybe pears, that sort of thing as well. And then more of that kind of toffee note.
Yeah, it's the sweetness that hits you right up front, and then you get a lot of that kind of subtle, soft fruitiness coming through, which I really like. So that it just has a little bit of oakiness at the end to help dry it out a bit and make you want to come back for more. I think I like this because it just coats your mouth so well. It's one of those that I could just sit here and just keep sipping and keep smashing it back. I think it's just too easy to drink.
It's a good sipper, and you know, it's also a great mixer as well. I quite like it with like a rhubarb soda, top like a nice highball, something like that's pretty good. Yeah, right. And do you know what? It's quite an interesting thing, because when we talk about women in whiskey, like we talk about, obviously mixing drinks, there's absolutely no right or wrong way. And I think Tamavullin's also quite a safe bet if you're looking to mix something. I was speaking to Fiona Speed, who's one of our kind of ambassadors, and she's done a lot of work with Tamavulin, and she had actually a really interesting observation we were talking about ahead of the panel. And she was saying quite often, as a female ambassador, she actually finds that a lot of women are more likely to approach her, and they're more likely to ask the questions about mixing. So I think it's such an interesting thing, because women do very much have a role to play in recruiting female drinkers into the category.
Yeah, that's something I think people have been talking about a lot lately, is having more representation of women in advertising, and, well, as much as you can advertise whiskey, because there's something so powerful about seeing yourself represented. And as you say, it's something that I think was missing for quite a long time. So it's really interesting to see people doing that. So absolutely. It's interesting you say that more women are interested in mixing their whiskey. Do you think, is that something you see quite a lot?
Not necessarily. I mean, like, I'm a good cask strength girl anytime. I do like to drink my whiskey neat, but I think people, not just necessarily women, but men as well, everyone is more open to exploring like different flavour profiles and being more flavour led. And I suppose using whiskey as well for different occasions. So, like at Christmas time, I like to pair my whiskies and do all sorts of different cocktails at different points in time. Yeah, so it's pretty fun. But I think as well, women in the industry help to bring a new perspective to things as well. They help to bring, and I suppose that's anybody from any sort of diverse background helps to bring a fresh set of eyes. And I think the thing that strikes me so much about Tamavullin's kind of production team, especially Sam and Joe, is their tenacity as well, because it is quite a remote distillery. It's on the edge of the River Livet. It's pretty out there, and it suffers from horrendous weather. I think we're just about through the worst of the winter snow. They had literally feet of it, but they really do have to be tenacious, and it's not a regular day-to-day job because they are so cut off. So Joe joined the distillery a couple of years ago, roughly about the same time as me actually. And one of the first conversations I had with her, she was telling me that she had maps and compasses out to try and find dents because something had gone wrong, and she had to kind of find something to fix with the water source. So
very hands-on.
Totally hands-on. But I also think as well it helps to kind of skill up. Like, so for me, I never went to university, but that hasn't prevented me from going into a career that typically would require a degree. Equally, as I mentioned with Sam, she did the same photography course as me, but she actually did her degree in marketing and advertising. And distilling came later. I mean, obviously there are things that you can do that are absolutely essential, like diplomas in distilling, that sort of thing. But actually, many of the production team at Tamavulin are double skilled. So we have like a joiner in house, which comes in very handy. A mechanic. In fact, one of the team actually built his own house as well. So you can imagine having that resource on hand is pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine, if something goes wrong in the distillery, you've got to be able to fix it right away, haven't you? You can't be waiting for somebody else to come in and do it for you. So I'm sure that helps. Yeah,
absolutely. I think ahead of actually the panel tonight, I did have a quick chat with Joe and Sam kind of their perception of the industry, and they had quite an interesting thing. So they were talking about, obviously 20 years ago it was quite a different landscape, but what they found as time's gone on is that people don't assume as much. So Sam and Joe introduced themselves as Sam and Joe, which initially 20 years ago, when people would maybe come into the office to try and sell something, or they would 100% assume. And in fact,
I've been on the same end of that as well, so I can understand that would be very confusing for some people.
Absolutely. So, but they do say like attitudes are changing, and people are much more hesitant now. They don't just automatically assume. But I thought one of the things that was lovely actually, when I was asking them, like, do they have any advice for women that do want to go into like STEM roles or STEM careers, whether that's like a laboratory scientist or into something totally different. And they said actually a lot of it's to do with that kind of attitude. So as long as you have the passion and the tenacity for what you do, you love what you do, and 100%, something that's consistent across the whiskey industry is everybody generally does love what they do.
It's quite a hard place to work if you don't. Yeah.
But what she said was, if you have about 75% of what the job lists, don't let that put you off applying, because skills can be built upon, and it shouldn't be a barrier. Absolutely.
Oh, that's fantastic. If there are any women who are watching this stream who have been thinking about a career in whiskey, there you go. You've got no excuse. Thank you. There was a great comment actually from Whisky. He says he's a big fan of this one, especially as a fiscally responsible Yorkshireman. So you've got at least one fan there. So that's
excellent. Brilliant. Glad to hear
it. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. I'm gonna ask you to come back in at the end, and if anyone has any questions at that point, we will be able to tackle those then. But thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Vin, can I ask you to queue up our next guest, please? Welcome, Louise.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you. So there is a slight change to our lineup today. If you have read our tasting card that's in the box, we had a very quick correction to this. So instead of Niamh McMahon, we have the wonderful Louise, who is joining us from JJ Corrie as well. Louise is actually the founder of JJ Corrie. So we are really excited to welcome Louise today. Louise, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started with the inspiration for JJ Corrie?
Yeah, first of all, let me say I'm really sorry that I messed up your printing run. I didn't know you had those things printed. I would have backed off, but I really wanted to be a part of this actually because I'm just such a massive supporter for anything to do with the Drinks Trust, first of all, and anything that sort of supports women in whiskies. So I said to Niamh, I want to do that one. And so I'm Louise. I'm the founder of JJ Corrie, and my background is it's the drinks industry, like hardcore drinks industry. So I spent my entire 20-something year career working for really big multinationals and working for some of the better known brands around the world. In whiskey and outside of whiskey, but I had the great fortune to work on a lot of the Johnny Walker higher marks and the classic malt collection from Diageo and bits and pieces sort of like that. I quit my job in 2015 and I decided I would set up an Irish whiskey company. I hadn't lived in Ireland since like 1995. Didn't know anybody here. But of course was born here and have family here and have a farm here, fortunately. So my dad is 80 now and he still farms the farm, but my brother doesn't and I don't, obviously. So I decided I'd come back to Ireland, and my initial plan was to do a grain to glass distillery, because that's what one does when one is setting up a whiskey company these days.
You start from the bare bones.
Yeah, you just grain to glass. That's rightly so. That's kind of what everybody's interested in. It's a great premise. So I started to kind of look around at the history of whiskey making locally where we are. We're located on the west coast of Ireland in County Clare. So if you looked at a map of Europe, the sticky outy bit, the most sticky outy bit on the left would be us here in County Clare. Like we're really kind of the last stop before Boston or New York, essentially. There's lots and lots of history of distillation locally here in Ireland. Unlike our brethren over in Scotland, we've had a really kind of patchy 100 years of whiskey making in Ireland. For a very long time, there was only 2 distilleries on the island who were kind of making every single Irish whiskey brand that you've ever heard of. And that really didn't change until the last 5 or 10 years. When I came into the business, I could tell that there was a bit of a renaissance going on in Irish whiskey. There was about to be a craft movement, an independent distiller movement, and that's what I decided to join. So in the midst of researching my grain to glass distillery plans, I discovered an old brand, a local brand from the 1890s called JJ Corrie. And it was a brand that was available from about 1890 till about the 1930s locally. It was a guy who was born in my parish here of Corrie-Clare. He had a little shop in the town of Kilrush. And out of that shop, he sold sherry, port, wine, rum, tea, bicycle parts, musical instruments, you name it, basically, ammunition, guns. And he also sold his own special malt, as he called it. And he marketed himself as a whiskey bonder. I found one of his old labels from the 1890s that a local antique dealer was selling. And I started to kind of research the history of that brand, JJ Corrie, and also the history of his trade, which was called whiskey bonding. And I'd never heard of that before. You know, I was very much on a grains glass distillery track, and I kind of spent a lot of time in the parliamentary archives in the UK, at the British Library, here in Ireland as well, looking at documentation from the late 1800s and the early 1900s around whiskey bonding, because it was obviously a very heavily regulated industry even back then. And I realized that whiskey bonding was once an absolutely core part of the Irish whiskey industry that perhaps hasn't been spoken about for a long time. Like, the Irish whiskey industry, unfortunately, effectively collapsed over a 50-year period. We had hundreds of distilleries on the island in 1870, and then by 1930 we only had kind of 2 or 3 left. And those distilleries, a lot of them didn't really bother branding and maturing and blending and branding their stocks. They just kind of sold them on to bonders. And in Ireland, the bonders, you know, there was 2 kinds. There was really big guys in Dublin who had massive bonded warehouses, who were blending all sorts of whiskey and sometimes adding in scotch as well, and then shipping it all over the empire. And then there was little guys like JJ Corrie, who were in every single town in Ireland, who did exactly what the big guys did. They sourced whiskey from their local distilleries. Very often they would just use whatever spent casks they had lying around in their shop, whether it was sherry or port or whatever. And then they'd bring those whiskies back to their shops and custom blend whiskies for their individual customers. So if you were a wealthy merchant family in Kilrush in 1910 or 1895, JJ Corrie would have had a particular housekeeper blend for you. Very kind of Downton Abbey.
Very cool. Yeah, I'd love to have my own house blend. That sounds wonderful.
So it's so cool, right? And yeah, and that happened all over Ireland. It was very common, and I just thought that was really interesting. So I ditched the grain to glass distillery idea, and I said, that's what I'm going to do. It's cool. It's interesting because it's a lost part of the heritage of Irish whiskey. So there's something, you know, real there. And it's also turned out to be a very good decision, because when I founded the business, there was 3 distilleries on the island. There are now 36.
So a lot of choice.
A lot of choice, a lot of liquid. It'd be boring if I was just blending 3 distilleries all the time. So my job now is I've built a rack house here on the farm, and my job is to curate a library of whiskey, spirit, and whiskey flavors from all over the country, from the older distilleries, and more importantly, from the newer distilleries with the different kind of styles. And we, very transparently, that's precisely what we do. I go out, I source new make, I go out, I source casks, we put the 2 together, we mature them here on the farm, and then when it's ready, we blend to create our JJ Corrie styles.
Fantastic. Well, I am very, very excited to try this next whiskey then. Could you explain a little bit about this particular blend that we're going to taste today?
Yeah, this is the Hansen. So this is an accidental first. It's very random because I'm a very big fan of grain whiskey. I think it's kind of undersung. I love it because it takes cask influence very well, obviously. And there's a kind of a lot that you can do with it, essentially, and it kind of comes of age relatively rapidly, but then it gets quite complex as time goes on. And you know, people are very focused on very often on using it in the blend, etc., etc. I have a great love for it, and I'm sort of a big fan. So the Hansen is randomly it is the first. There isn't even a category for this, but in Irish whiskey, it's the first blended grain, right? So it contains whiskey, grain whiskey from 2 different distilleries. There's a 70% 10-year-old grain in here, and then 30% 4-year-old grain. The 4-year-old grain has been fully matured here on the farm in casks I source myself. They were first fill ex Jack Daniels and Woodford Reserve casks. So they spent their first 4 years in those very reactive casks. Actually, we've had to pull it out of those casks because that stopped because it's too reactive. And then the 10-year-old is from Cooley Distillery, and that would have kind of been in a mishmash of first and second fill bourbon casks as well. Like, so the cask style is pretty consistent throughout. And we sort of put those together because I wanted to do a grain expression, and that kind of made sort of sense to me. And it's the first one that's happened in Ireland, kind of fairly, and just nobody has done that in Ireland necessarily. They might have, but maybe they don't talk about it. I don't really know. But for us as a bonder, that's what we do. You know, we take different distillates and we put it together, and that's kind of our vibe. So it makes a lot of sense. It's bottled at 46% ABV, no chill filtration, no artificial color. I just don't do that. I'm not into it. I'm all about kind of, I feel like whatever comes out of the cask, that's what you get. Yeah, and it's a lovely, it's really interesting because when I nose it, I always get the two different grains that are going into it. Like the 4-year-old grain that has gone into this, I know very intimately. I've known it since it was born, and I've been very kind of close to it kind of as it's come up along. And then the 10-year-old is a much kind of meatier, more rounder kind of aspect of this. But yeah, I think this is very J.J. Corrie style. Like, we like a bit of fruit, you know, we like to play up that Irish whiskey fruit in everything that we do. It's a nice kind of standout point for Irish whiskey. And I think you sort of get that. You get a little bit of sort of certainly kind of green apples going on there. Yeah. And there's a bit of kind of, I always think like childhood kind of sherbety sort of stuff going on as well, like tangy kind of sherbety, I think, as well on the nose.
Yeah, it's great you said apples, because I was thinking toffee apples immediately.
Yeah, and those kind of vanilla and toffee kind of bits, like they definitely come in on the palate as well. Almost like there's almost kind of a hobnobby kind of thing, nearly kind of that sort of comes in as well.
Like a little slight hint of something sour as well.
Yeah, I've often described this as a little bit tang, you know, those tang fastics, super sour, which I love, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, so the palate then really evolves. It's very different. Like, we try to build in layers when we do a blend. We try to get layers of stuff going on. I think essentially, I think you get you know, there's a lot more going on in the palate. There's still quite a bit of those kind of fresh, vibrant sort of fruits going on. I always get a little bit of kind of like ginger as well, almost like sort of fresh ginger going on, maybe evolving kind of into candied ginger in the palate a little bit later on. There's a nice little bit of heat in it that sort of really stands out in that regard. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you on the spice notes at the end there. There's a great question here from Amy Seaton, who is part of the Birmingham Whisky Club. Hi, Amy. She says, is there much difference between bourbon casks from different distilleries? Do they impact anything you could detect in difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, so I'm really obsessed with casks, right? So I have this great advantage, like I'm not a distiller. And distilling is really very, 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 you know, it takes up a lot of headspace if you're doing that. Obviously, you know, it's a biological kind of and it's a biological kind of thing that's going on. So it takes a lot of headspace. So I spent all my time thinking about cask influence from the get-go, and I worked really closely with cooperages and other distilleries and other wineries and stuff like that, like around the world, honing in on cask flavor. So I can tell you right now that like we have the Kentucky casks that I get them from Kentucky. Like, I go to Kentucky. I used to go every year and select my casks and stuff like that. And I get really hardcore. Like, I'll go, okay, I want a Jack, you know, I'll go, okay, I want some Jack Daniels casks, but we need that particular kind of varietal, whatever it happens to be. Or on the Woodford Reserve side, same sort of thing. And there is a difference, yeah. If they're fresh, juicy casks that are first fill, and you get them from Kentucky after being disgorged, to Ireland really quick, which we do, you really see a difference. Like it takes a couple of years, but they start to go in kind of different directions. Like, I don't think we talk enough about how much we owe very often to our brothers in bourbon. You know, a lot of that flavor, particularly on grain whiskey, like a lot of that flavor profile.
I got to say, I think it's very refreshing how transparent you guys seem to be when it comes to things about casks and provenance of the whiskey. It's definitely something you don't see quite as often from some people. So it's really interesting to hear, you know, they're very specific. It's come out of these brands, casks. It's like this. You know, I'm sure it does make a difference, although I've never been lucky enough to try them side by side.
Oh, it definitely does. Like, yeah, like I can't write that on my label. You know, I'll get sued Sunday. But I can tell you, and that's why social media is great. Like, and this kind of stuff is great. Like, I just think if you're going to purchase if you are going to spend your money on something that I have made, you deserve to know everything about it. I want to know what's in my food. I want to know where the cotton for my sweater came from. Like, I got to know that stuff. And I feel the same way when it comes to our whiskeys. Like, it's not, you know, you work hard for your money. We work hard to make these whiskeys. So I just want to be open book about it, you know? Yeah, that's really very much core to what we do. And I think it's just really important as well to these days to have that level of transparency. People deserve it and they want it.
That's a really interesting comment. So thank you so much for that. You've caused a bit of a kerfuffle in the comments. It looks like a lot of people saying that they're really enjoying the whiskey. Matthew Lamb says he's never tried anything like it before. Derek Young says, best Irish I've tasted, so many flavors going on. Whisky says, you've started a fight here with this one, but the grain fan here loves it. So some really interesting comments coming through on that. So yeah, I think you found a few new fans here with that. So thanks so much for coming on, Louise. And I'll ask you to, if we can, just nip off now, and we'll bring you back in at the end. I'm sure that it looks like there's probably going to be quite a few more questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. And our next guest, if you wouldn't mind, Vin, is the lovely Annabelle Thomas, who comes to us from Knocknean. I think you're muted there.
Technical fail already.
That's all right. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So this whiskey might be quite new for some of our tasters this evening. It's definitely one that's new for us. So I, for one, am very excited about this. So could you tell us a little bit about your wonderful distillery, please?
I could. So I'm Annabelle. I'm the founder of Knocknean. We are a new-ish distillery on the west coast of Scotland. It's been a very long journey for me, as whiskey distilleries always are, but we actually only released our first whiskey last year. So it is very new to the world, if not new to me.
New-ish.
New-ish, exactly. So I left my job in London in 2013 to found Knocknean. Really, we're trying to do two things, I guess. One is bring a real focus on sustainability to the Scotch whiskey industry, which was something I really felt was missing. And also, I think as a new distillery, we have the freedom to be a bit more creative in terms of what we make and how we make it. And I think that's a really exciting thing to be able to bring to the Scotch industry as well. So yeah, I left a fairly corporate job in 2013 with not much knowledge of the whiskey industry, but a passion for doing those two things. Spent 2 years raising funds, spent 2 years actually building the distillery, and we finally started distilling in March 2017. So our whiskey came of age early last year.
Fantastic. So how did you get into whiskey then? You said that you didn't know that much about it before. So what happened to trigger that?
Well, it was initially a family story, actually not dissimilar to Louise. The distillery is on my parents' farm, and I think you can't really help but be on the west coast of Scotland and think about whiskey. So that actually got us thinking about it. I took some time off from my job in 2012 because we had been pondering, and I thought, well, let's do some investigation, because otherwise we're going to ponder this for 20 years and never do anything about it. So I went to Islay actually to do a few distillery tours there. Got really, actually it was the point I started liking whiskey, ironically, but also was the point I realised that there's this amazing tradition in Scotch, which I think is absolutely brilliant, but at that point there were not that many newer distilleries with maybe a more forward-looking view of things, and I thought that was really missing. And in particular, I wasn't hearing anybody talk about sustainability, and that was the thing that kicked me into it.
True, isn't it? A lot of Scotch distilleries, especially when you go and visit, the thing they talk about the most is how traditional they are and how they do things the old way. And I look at our old grain mill and look at our old this, and yeah, it's, as you say,
exactly, which is absolutely
beautiful. Yeah, it's really romantic. But as you say, it's then really hard to bring in that kind of sustainable element. Oh, sorry, I lost you there for a sec.
Exactly, and Scotch wouldn't be in the place. Scotch wouldn't be in the place it is if that didn't exist. And there is this amazing tradition, but I think there's also a role for, more forward-looking and different approaches as well. So that's what we're aiming to bring.
So how do you do that then?
How do we do it? Well, so as I said, sustainability is a big part of what we do. Everything we make is organic. Our distillery is powered by 100% renewable energy. We recycle all our water, for example. We're a zero waste distillery, so 99.97% of our waste is reused or recycled. And we have a great focus on things like packaging. So our whiskey bottle, for example, is one of the first 100% recycled clear glass bottles, which reduces the carbon footprint by 40%.
Just as a side note, I'm really glad that you've showed us a bottle, because it is beautiful. Chris and myself were discussing this. Obviously when we make our minis, we can't make a really adorable mini version of your bottle, but it is stunning. So and then to hear that it's recycled glass as well, even better. So
yeah, exactly. And then I guess the other side of what we do is just try to take as creative approach as possible to everything we do. So our first product, for example, was a botanical spirit, which is like a gin, but it's based on new make, so it's got quite an interesting flavor profile. And we spend a lot of time in the distillery thinking about different yeast recipes, for example, and running yeast experiments to create different flavors, and just being quite creative with how we make our spirits.
That does sound like a lot of fun. Yes. So talk us through the one we have today is really, I suppose, your main whiskey, the organic single malt. So this could be described as sort of the house style. Would that be fair to say?
Yes,
so talk us a little bit about how you've got to that point, and what. Yeah, talk to us about the whiskey, and let's taste it at the same time.
Perfect. So what you all have is our organic whiskey. It's what we released last September. It's bottled at 46%. It is, we like to think, an embodiment of what we were aiming for, light, fruity and creamy. And it is made with a mixture of STR red wine casks and bourbon casks, 65% STR, 35% bourbon. STR red wine casks are a very special kind of cask. They are shaved, toasted and recharred. That's what STR stands for, which really works to caramelize the red wine residues, if you like, that are left in the cask. And that produces a lot of the intensity that you get in the dram and some of the kind of more spicy notes. But we like that balance with the ex-bourbon cask, which produce some of the more sweeter and vanilla-y flavors. Should we have a we have a nose and a try? So on the nose, I get quite a lot of, it's quite light, but also some citrusy elements and some stone fruits.
Quite a bit different to the last one that we've just tried.
Massive contrast.
Oh, there's an interesting comment here. I'd like to get your opinion on this, since you mentioned that you went to Islay and had quite a lot of inspiration from there. So this is one of the questions in the comment. Sorry, I'm a big fan of sustainability, particularly as I believe using peat isn't sustainable. What do you think about that?
I'm afraid I agree. That is one of the reasons we don't use peat. I don't think, I mean, yeah, I just don't think it's justifiable. You're basically digging up a carbon sink. So
yeah,
this couldn't really be.
We've no way of creating peat in a lab yet, as far as I know. So
exactly.
Eventually we will run out.
Exactly.
So no plans on a smoky whiskey then?
No, exactly. No plans for that, I'm afraid. We buy 100% Scottish organic barley from 10 farmers in Scotland, and that will remain what we do.
Fantastic.
So
back to the whiskey.
Back to this, yeah. One of the things.
What are your tasting notes? What do you get when you try this?
On the nose, I get lots of. It's quite light, but lots of fruitiness and citrusiness. And then when we taste it, you get some of that spiciness coming through, which is from the STR casks. But it's also quite creamy and oily. And we think that actually that partly comes from the fact the grains are organic. So we only make organic whiskey, organic spirits, so we've got nothing to compare it to, but certainly based on kind of what we know and other things we can taste, we think that we made it organic not for taste reasons, but for sustainability reasons and to protect the biodiversity in the supply chain. But we think that it also produces some of that oiliness, which gives it a lovely body and also makes it excellent mixed with soda, which is one of our favourite ways to drink it. So
given that your grain is all organic, as you said, it's from 10 different farmers, do you find, are there much variation in between batches? Is this kind of a fairly consistent quantity? I know that you usually release this in batches at the moment, don't you?
We do, and so there is variation between batches of whiskey, and every bottle of our whiskey has the batch number on the back of the neck, the number of bottles, and then we've got also much like Louise, we've got all of that information on our website, so you can go onto our website and see all of the information about exactly what cask they were, when they were distilled, etc., etc. The variation between those batches comes more from the casks than it does for anything else. There is some variation in the grain, but it's over a very long period of time because you're really working harvest to harvest, so it's on a year-to-year basis rather than on a weekly or a monthly basis. So
okay, so if you were to take two different batches, if you taste differences, it's more likely due to the casks than any differences in the grain itself.
Definitely, yeah, and you will taste differences between the batches. Then we're aiming for the same style, but there's only 15 casks in each batch. It's impossible that they're all the same. So when we're creating the next batch, we're trying to create some level of consistency so people know what to expect, but also trying to make the best whiskey we can with the kind of portfolio we're working with. So.
Do you think that that volume are you hoping to increase that in the future? Will that stay fairly consistent?
We will increase it a little bit. Actually, the 5,000 is driven as much by the size of our vat at the moment as it is by any love of the number 5,000. But we'll also we'll never go into really big batches, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 bottles in a batch.
Good question there from Amy again. She asks, how do casks fit into the organic process?
Casks are, well, there's actually some inconsistency in the industry on this. But basically we can use what casks we want, which is lucky. You have to basically make sure they're clean and rinsed out and all that kind of stuff. But we're allowed to use whatever cask we want. So that is helpful for us, to say the least, because if we were restricted to organic casks, we'd be in some trouble.
Yeah, I can't imagine, are there many organic certified casks around at the moment?
I've never found one. I mean, we could find some organic wineries in France. I think that would be as close as we could get. But.
Okay, great question though. Certainly something for thought anyway. So thanks. I have to say I'm really enjoying this. It's not like anything I've tried before, I think, at least from memory. Really enjoying that kind of soft, ripe fruitiness, like ripe nectarines.
Exactly, yeah. Spot on. And that part of the taste comes from the spirit. And we spend a lot of time trying to make our spirit as delicious and fruity as possible. Partly, for example, through using 2 different yeasts in our fermentation process, one of which is more of a traditional distilling yeast, but one of which we choose especially to give us those lovely fruity notes.
Yeah, I think you've probably found a few new fans there as well. And for such a young Scotch too, it's definitely quite different to what I think most people would consider to be, a good Scotch whiskey, let's say. For just over the 3-year mark, the amount of flavour that's in there is really great. So that's fantastic.
I think if you set out knowing you're going to make a young whiskey, and there's no reason that young whiskies can't be great these days.
Absolutely agree with you on that. Yeah, it's really great to see yourselves and lots of other distilleries as well putting out young whiskey that stands up. So I'm also very excited to see what's coming next. Can you give us any sneak peeks? What are your plans for the future?
Well, it's still very early days for us. We are focused for the next probably 6 months just on doing what we're doing, and continuing to grow, and in particular grow across Europe, because we're only in a few countries in Europe at the moment, and there's lots of people in countries across Europe that are keen for Nick Meehan to be there. And then as of autumn this year, we'll start thinking about some special releases. We've already got some exciting things in the pipeline, but as yet TBD what they actually are.
So we'll watch this space then.
Watch this space.
Okay, great. Well, after that very, very teasing line there, thank you so much, Annabelle, for joining us. And we will see you back at the end as well. So thank you so much for coming on.
See you then. Thanks for having me.
Bye. So those of you that liked the grain whiskey from JJ Corrie, you're in for a treat, because our next one is another lovely grain whiskey. So can I bring on Jill from Compass Box, please? I think you might be muted as well there, Jill. Great.
Yep. Tempting to unmute myself there.
That's all right. How are you?
Really good, really good. I noticed there was a little comment went up in the private chat just for the green room saying anyone's doing anything on their computer, it might be causing a lag. And I thought it's probably me Googling every single whiskey that we've been going through so far. Like everything has just been amazing. It's so good. So yeah, really, really exciting.
Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying it so far. I certainly am, and I'm also quite excited about this next one because I have actually tried this one before, but it's been a very long time. So I'm looking forward to the refresher. So, so Jill, you're from Compass Box, who I'm sure some of our audience might be more familiar with than some of our other whiskies earlier today. Compass Box, in your own words, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and yourself as well?
Sure, of course. So I'm Jill Boyd. I'm one of the blenders for Compass Box Whisky. We are the most awkward Scotch whisky company you can get because we are a Scotch whisky that makes Scotch in London. So our main offices are based in London, and we do all our kind of like prototype blending, and all our whisky work happens in London. And then I delightfully get to travel back home up to Scotland, where we put the blends together and then bottle them. So it's a really, really complex and interesting process. And I think that definitely for John, who is our founder, it's worked really well because it's given him access to step away from how everyone else in the industry is doing things 20, 21 years ago when we started, and kind of look at where he wants to shape his kind of blending. So yeah, we are, as I said, 21 years old this year, which doesn't really feel believable because I don't even know where last year went, as a lot of people kind of, I'm sure, are in the same boat. But yeah, 21 years old, and Hedonism, which we're going to be tasting, was our very, very first whiskey that we produced as a company. And much like Louise was saying from JJ Corrie, this created a new category of blended grain in the Scotch whisky world. So it was really exciting when I heard her mention that, because it was like, it's like twinsies, like across the yeah. And I was just like, it's amazing. So yeah, it was really, really exciting, and yeah, just kind of pioneering at the time. But we're so lucky. Great grain, great whiskey. That's what we're here for. But to be honest, my job is so complicated and also so simple. If you ask my dad, which I sometimes do, I say, Dad, what do you tell people I do? He says, you get drunk during the day and then sometimes drunker during the evening. And like my colleagues, they're like, you spend a lot of days sitting kind of hunched over a table with a lot of booze in front of you. My main job is quality and making sure that we absolutely hit the best casks we can for every single batch we do. Hedonism is, I think, the most beautiful example of that we're going to try, because when we make hedonism, we make it in small batches, and the flavor and the style is so light and so creamy and just delicate that if we one cask with and I say an off note, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just doesn't mean it's the same style as what we're looking for. You can pick it up so easily. So myself and James, who are the two whiskey makers, two of the main whiskey makers for the company, we really focus hard on making sure that we have every single thing perfect for every blend. So yeah, so it's a good job. It can be quite tiring, but it's really good.
I can imagine that would be tiring and also very rewarding.
Yeah, that's the one.
So you've actually had quite a lot of different roles in the whiskey industry. Is that right? Is that fair to say? Can you tell us a little bit about the different things you've done, any highlights that you've had, that sort of thing?
So I didn't get into whiskey in a traditional way. I wanted to be a scientist ever since I was little. I actually wanted to be a pathologist, but when I found out that once you became a doctor, you then had to study for like another 7 or 8 years to become a pathologist, I was like, maybe I don't want to spend 15 years of my life learning to do one job, because what if I don't like it? So I thought, right, science generally. I did forensics at uni. I wanted to work in genetics. And when I graduated and was looking for a job, I took a position with a whiskey bar. And that's where everything kind of fell into place, because as I learned to like love and appreciate whiskey, I realized how much science and how much artistry goes in. I think not just blending, but the actual making of whiskey is as big a combination of really knowing your skill and being able to hone like all the different parts of the whiskey making process together, as it is kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the right weather on the right day to produce the perfect whiskey. I used to work with a guy called Stanley when I worked at William Grant & Sons, and he always used to say he loved distilling in the depth of winter when there's like a foot of snow outside, because the whiskey would sing as it came off the stills. And there's a poetry and a beauty to making whiskey that taken away from science and is pure art, but the science has to be there as well. So yeah, it's the ultimate blend of creativity and kind of like practical stuff. So when I was there, I used to work, I checked our effluent, which was the wastewater production from the distillery. I got to help run I ran the 3 whiskey nosing panels for Glenfiddich, Balvenie and Kinninvie at the time. Basically making sure that the spirit that came off the stills, I made sure a panel of people checked that and confirmed that what we were getting was what we expected. Because sometimes those days, as was mentioned about the differences in the barley from batch to batch, sometimes our barley might produce a slightly different nose, or sometimes the weather would encourage the esters in the fermentation to kind of create big kind of oomphy flavors that were maybe a little bigger than we expected. And it's good to kind of keep an eye on what your distillery is making. So yeah, I was lucky when I worked for my first couple of jobs in the whiskey industry. It was fingers and lots of different pies just to see what was happening. And now I work as a blender and a kind of stand-in brand ambassador. So anytime we've got tastings, it's great to come and like chat to people. But I think I'm so lucky to do what I do. I love my job, and it's just, yeah, it's really, really cool.
Oh, that's so good to see. Thank you. Great. So tell us about the whiskey then. Let's taste. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm going to give full note. I'm drinking a mug of tea and drinking a glass of whiskey at the same time, because I'm sitting at the back of my living room wearing a blanket, as well as like all my kind of normal warm stuff. So this is just giving me the little heat of coziness that I need to really enjoy this tonight. But the key to oh, sorry, Harry.
How cold is it up there then? It sounds cold.
My phone advising me it's 8 degrees, but if it's 8 degrees, I've obviously spent too much time in London because it was -3 last night and I thought my toes were going to go blue. So yeah, we're getting some chills now.
Okay, well,
but the
whiskey hopefully will help.
Yeah, it'll definitely warm us up. So one of the things about hedonism is it's all matured in first or rechar bourbon barrels. That's why it's got that beautiful pale color. It's really golden, sweet, creamy on the nose, and that gorgeous fattiness that I always associate with grain whiskey. The grain from earlier, where they were talking about tang-fastics and that mouth-watering kind of like bitter juiciness. Well, not bitter, but like kind of fizzy juiciness. That's not a hedonism trait. We are all about like ice cream sundaes that have been left in the heat. It's like creme brulee that has just been toasted and served. It's delicate burnt sugar, vanilla.
I was going to say a little bit of toasted marshmallow almost.
I love that. Yeah, I never thought about the marshmallow.
It's that carrot, you know, when you leave it on the fire too long and it burns.
Yeah,
which is the best way of doing it, by the way.
Exactly. But I love it. It's like thick white chocolate and like cocoa butter. It's all those big creamy fats that I just think are absolutely
in a really good way. It reminds me of, you know, you can get those conditioners and body washes that have shea butter in them. I get that in here.
I always think
a diesel, not in a good way, again, like a little hint of dieseliness.
Yeah, there is like I don't know if it's just grain, though it might be something that I don't pick out of other areas, but I always get that kind of Riesling-y, petrol, diesel kind of background in grain whiskies, and I'm not 100% sure where it comes from. I guarantee someone can let me know, but there is something lovely about that. I love that kind of
refined.
Yeah, that's it. It's refined, but it's beautiful, and on the palate, big and
really silky.
Oh, silky it's the way. I love the fact that it's so oily and it just coats your entire mouth. It's kind of like when I was younger and I worked in that whiskey bar, I was dared to eat like one of the little pats of butter that you get brought out with like a scone, and just to eat it on its own. And the way that coated my mouth will never leave me. And for a while I thought it would actually not leave me, like that coating, but hedonism is exactly the same. It just goes round and it's like in between every single one of your like teeth, and it's over your gums. It's beautiful, but then it's gone in a second. It's this big rich experience, and then it finishes. And that's where hedonism becomes my danger whiskey, because I will refill my glass and not realize that I've had like 3 or 4 drams because I'm just contentedly sipping it. It's like that waiter at a restaurant who keeps insidiously filling up your wine glass. You can drink all night and not even realize. It's just absolutely beautiful. But yeah, so the hedonism, I've noticed you guys have mentioned in the comments that this is actually a combination of 2 different distilleries. It's North British and Cameron Bridge. Sometimes we put a little bit of Port and Das in there as well, which is, oh God, so good, but getting much, much harder to find. And as blenders, we work with what we're offered, because we're a blending house and we don't produce our own. It's really hard. We don't take non-alcoholic things and turn them into alcohol, but we take spirits and turn them into different spirits. So I always say we don't make our own whiskey, but it's more we don't make the alcohol that then becomes the whiskey. But when we take our different kind of parcels and barrels of whiskey and put them together, we make something completely different. So yeah, it's really, really lovely. I also love it, like just in the summer to sip. I think it's so good. It just, I love it.
Absolutely. Again, I think you've got quite a few fans in the chat too. Amy again says, love this dram. Grain is so underrated. Fully agree with her on that. But then again, if people get too into it, there won't be as much left for me. So maybe we need to keep it a secret a bit more. A few more people say getting the cocoa butter notes. I really like this one. It tastes like vanilla's sassy cousin.
Yeah, it is. It reminds me of like those gorgeous bright yellow kind of vanilla ice creams like that you get in the seaside where it's all flavor, and I just think it's gorgeous.
I'm very jealous there of Jason B. Standing nibbling a chocolonely. alongside?
I don't know what it is, but I'm quite peckish, so any kind of nibbling chocolate is perfect.
Sounds great. Maybe next time we should do a whiskey and chocolate tasting. I think that would be great.
Yeah,
just a little idea there for Chris.
Yeah, this tastes beautifully with like really dark chocolate truffles or Parmesan. You've either got to go like chocolate or you've got to go like hyper salty cheese. Yeah, the two of them together are pretty amazing.
I'll have to try that at some point. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill. I'm aware of time, so if you don't mind joining us again in just a little while, I will bring on our next whiskey guest. Thank you, Jill.
Sure.
Hello, Laura.
Hi, Harry.
How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Our second Laura of the evening. So this is Laura Davies. She comes to us from
in the chat.
So she comes to us from the wonderful Penderyn. So for those that are not familiar, you should be, a wonderful Welsh distillery. So Laura is the distillery manager.
Yeah.
And I gather you've been there for quite a long time and you've had quite a varied experience there. So tell us a little bit about what life at Penderyn is like.
Yeah, so I've been at Penderyn now for about 9 years, I think it is. And in that time, I started off as a trainee distiller. Seems like a very long time ago now. And when I joined, the company was quite a lot smaller than it is at the moment. We were probably producing around 90,000 litres of pure alcohol per year. And that was our maximum capacity. And since I joined over the past few years, we've pretty much increased production capacity now up to about 400,000 litres of alcohol per year. So we've gone through quite a massive change, and I don't really remember the distillery as it was when I started. I know it was like that because I've got photographs, but I don't really remember that time. It just seems to have sort of evolved so much. I was really fortunate in that when I joined the distillery, I was able to train under Dr. Jim Swan, and I was able to train under him for about 6 years until he sadly passed away. But that was really great because it gave me such a great introduction to whiskey, and Jim was a real expert in wood management in all aspects of distilling. So that was really great. It was really hands-on. I couldn't have learned that stuff from a university course or from a textbook. I was completely immersed in it. So I really, really fortunate in that sense.
There's another nice link there, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Dr. Jim Swan had a hand in creating the STR cask that Annabelle was speaking about earlier. Is that right? Yeah.
So Jim sort of really sort of pioneered that, and he worked really hard on it to develop it, and it was really great because it certainly for Penderyn, it's given us such a different dimension to our products, and it's just given us so much more creativity. And it's used now in our Myth bottling, and it's used in some of our other bottlings, and it was just another dimension to the flavors. It really showed off just how creative and he could be. It was really great. I think Annabelle would agree with that.
I'm sure she would. Thank you. Great. So I know you've got something very exciting as well going on at the distillery. Could you give us a little sneak preview of what the future looks like?
Yeah, sure. So Penderyn has been going now as a distillery since the year 2000. As I said, at that point we were producing around 90,000 RPA per year, and we've increased that through a two-stage expansion in 2013 and 2014 up to 400,000 RPA per year. But I'm not sure if any of you have actually been to our distillery. It's in the Brecon Beacon. It's a really lovely part of the world, but we've kind of outgrown it now. We really can't squeeze any more in. In fact, we had to move our bottling line and things to another site in order to get more stills in. Just can't fit any more in. And so with that in mind, and to get a bit more sort of creativity and to help get our brand out there to people elsewhere in Wales, over the next sort of 2 years, we're actually opening 2 further sites in Wales, one in North Wales in Llandudno, which is due to open all being well, in providing that the Welsh Government are on site with the current regulations, but that should be opening in May 2021. And then a third distillery in Swansea in South Wales, not too far from our current site now, but that should hopefully be opening up in sort of mid 2022.
Very exciting times then. So what will be the plan for those 2 new sites? Will they be making anything different, or will it just be an extension of what you're already doing?
So firstly, it's important to note that they will, just as our current site now welcomes visitors. We currently get about 40,000 visitors per year to our current site. But we're very aware that people don't really want to drive to a whiskey distillery. Kind of takes the fun away if you can't really go here. So hopefully we'll get an awful lot of visitors in. So we're looking to sort of really maximise our visitor numbers and help get everybody through the distillery that wants to come and enjoy the experience. What we're looking for our North Wales distillery in Llandudno is to do probably a peated variety, a peated product. Quite what shape that will take yet, we're not entirely sure. We've done some trials, but we're focusing on a peated range there to start off with. The Swansea site, that'll be a bit more for experimentation, but that's a really nice thing. We'll have the capacity, we'll have the site, we'll have the space to be creative. And one of the really nice things about Penderyn is that because we're an independently run distillery, we perhaps don't always have the budget that the big distilleries have, or the sort of the size and the focus that big distilleries have. But we do have a very passionate team, and with an independently run distillery, we as a production team have the ability to go to the senior management team and to our board of directors and say, actually, we want to do something a little bit different with this product. We want to be a bit more creative. We want to try this. We want to try that, and we've got the freedom to do that. So that's really great as producers to be able to have that sort of freedom and flexibility.
Mm. Yeah. And so how did you get into whiskey in the first place then?
So much like Jill, actually, my degree is actually in forensic science.
Wow.
And to be honest, when I did my degree, I had hopes of doing what you see on the TV, working in that kind of thing, crime investigation.
CSI, yeah.
Yeah. When I came to graduate, the job market wasn't really that great. It was 2012. A lot of things were being privatized and things that there just weren't really the opportunities. And so I thought, well, I'm not really sure what I want to do. So I'll just apply for any job going, just to sort of get me an employment while I decide what grown-up job I want to do. And the problem is that if you put out an advert for somebody to work in a whiskey distillery, every either whiskey enthusiast or alcoholic within 20 miles wants to apply. So Penderyn were a little bit sneaky and put out the job advert as a PO box address, no sort of company name on it. It was very, very vague, very ambiguous. And I think it was described as something like a food technician. And I applied for it thinking, this is going to be really boring, but I'll do it for a little bit until my grown-up job comes along. And then I got invited to an interview at this address that I didn't recognise, and it was all a bit secretive. And I was told, you'll have to try whiskey when you get there. And my mum was saying, that's a bit risky, But I turned up, and I always remember from my first interview, I sat across the table from Dr. Jim Swan. I didn't know who he was at the time. And his words to me were, do you know anything about whiskey? Oh, sorry, our managing director said, do you know anything about whiskey? I said, nothing at all. And he said, well, this is Dr. Jim Swan. He's a world expert in whiskey. I'll leave you to it for a bit. That was my introduction to the company and to whiskey. And I had a very strange interview where I had to sort of do a sensory assessment of, I think it was 10 or 15 different glasses containing different things. And I had to smell and taste them to assess what they were and their qualities. And fortunately, I got through, and yeah, that's how I started. And I've been there ever since. And I do sometimes have a sense, when I sit with friends who are teachers or nurses who have really, important jobs, and I do feel a little bit bad that my job is to basically drink whiskey and produce whiskey. And I've got this lovely fun job that allows me to travel and do all this kind of stuff. And I sometimes think I should probably get a grown-up job at some point. But yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people in the comments would agree with me, but I think making whiskey is a very important job. So
I'm certainly very popular at my son's school, put it that way.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Celt, which we are trying today?
Yeah, sure. So we've got our Celt product, which is one of our, I'm not sure if you can see that, one of our Dragon range. So for anybody that's not familiar with it, we've got our main product range is our Gold range, which is bottled at 46%, and then we've got a secondary range, which is our Dragon range, bottled at 41%. Celt is a peated version of our whiskey. It's really important to note before we go any further that we don't do a strong peat. So for anybody that's used to a really heavily peated whiskey, you won't find that at Penderyn. And in fact, the product is very, very light in style. So if you were to nose it, you'll notice first of all that it's a very, very light sort of smoke. It doesn't really come across that much on the nose at all, and you have to really look for it to start off with. It's quite grassy, slightly citrusy. I get quite a bit of honey on the nose, but it's very, very smooth. Sorry, very slightly sort of custardy, marmalade.
Yeah, certainly just a little tiny hint of that kind of seaside smoke.
Absolutely. Sorry. If you then to taste it, you get quite a lot of marmalade then. I'm sorry, in the taste.
Marmalade notes.
Marmalade, yeah.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of orange citrus fruit. I'm really sorry. Brown sugar, slightly grassy. It's very, very slightly medicinal, but again, the peat is very, very slight, very slight. And one of the reasons for that is that at Penderyn we have quite a unique still system. So you can look this up online. Otherwise, it'll be a very, very lengthy sort of explanation. But basically, we use a copper still with a series of plates inside that allow us to really refine the spirit and draw off the spirit at a very high ABV. So our cut points at Penderyn for the Penderyn still are between 92 and 89% ABV. So that allows us to have a really light, really high strength spirit, very, very smooth, very fruity. But what it does mean is that if we overload that with too much peat, it just crushes the spirit character completely, and you won't be able to recognize it as Penderyn. It's really, really important to us that if you pick up a glass of Penderyn, no matter what expression it is, you can see it's Penderyn, you can taste it's Penderyn, you know just by nosing it that it's Penderyn. So that's one of the reasons that we don't overload it with peat. The way that we don't overload it with peat is that we put our anemic spirit, we don't use a peated barley, we put our anemic spirit into a peated cask. So a cask that's previously held quite a richly peated whiskey from Ireland. We put that anemic spirit into that cask and allow it to mature into a peated whiskey. So it's quite an unusual sort of, it's more of a peated maturation than a peated distillation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a nice comment from Chris there saying he would definitely say that this is a gateway whiskey for getting started with peat. I think I'd probably agree on that one. The peat is there for sure. I think you definitely know it's there, but it's not so heavy that it's could be intimidating for people who aren't used to drinking smoky whiskey. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, you do have to sort of look for it slightly at first, and then once you find it, you know it's there.
There was a question here as well about your new site, which you mentioned one of them might make a peated whiskey, so it does tie in quite nicely. Will it still be Penderyn, or will there be new brands launched for these new sites?
I think we're probably still working on that. I think there probably will be some new brands that come out of that. But as you can imagine, that takes quite a lot of work at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. One last comment here coming through about the peat. For me, the peat comes across as quite grassy and herbal, which is nice. So there we go.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Laura. We will invite our last guest on, and then I'll ask you to come back in at the end.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us all the way from the much freer than we are currently New Zealand.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Welcome. I gather it's quite early in the morning there, but so you don't have to taste, but if you want to, that's absolutely fine. So Sarah, as I mentioned, is dialing in all the way from New Zealand. She is from the Cardrona distillery, so this is our final dram for the night as well, and our 6th dram in the tasting box. So Sarah, I gather you're at the distillery right now, are you not?
I am. I'm sitting on our mezzanine floor from the cellar door space, the distillery door. So if it is a little bit loud, I'll just let me know and I'll tell them to park down there. I am in a unique situation in that I'm not at home right now. I'm absolutely at work. The Cardrona distillery is an outstanding location. We are between Wanaka and Queenstown on the South Island of New Zealand, and yes, a little freer than most of the world. We're at work, and it's sort of business as normal. Very happy to get back stuck into making whiskey here.
Yeah, fantastic. So for those who haven't seen, Cardrona is in an absolutely beautiful location. If you just Google it, you'll see what I mean. It's down right in the bottom of the South Island, surrounded by gorgeous mountains, ski fields, absolutely stunning. So when we're all allowed to get out of our houses again, if you get the chance to go over that way, definitely probably worth a visit, I think. Although I've not been there myself. I would love to get there.
We'd love to have you. Very much an open door environment, and this place did not exist prior to 2015, so we have a short history but an action-packed one, and really every day is just realising the dream of our chief executive, Desiree Whittaker. So we're very much led by women here, and I am the master distiller for Cardrona Distillery, and I manage a production team of 3 distillers who just happen to be female. And celebrating women in whiskey is not something we do every day, because it is our everyday. It's just the way it is here at Cardrona. And it's not to say we don't have fantastic men on our team as well. We are a team of 37, including the UK. We have 7 fantastic staff members based in the UK. 2 of them are with us tonight, my morning, celebrating your first step out of lockdown. I think kids are back to school this week, so I'm sure they have yes. Dram in hand. But no, it's a pleasure to be here, and our connection to the UK is something that we're really committed to, and we have been sending whiskey your way, and not just whiskey. We make vodka, gin and liqueurs, all from malted barley as well.
So you've mentioned this, but the distillery itself is quite new. So the gin and the vodka were the first releases. And when did the whiskey launch?
The whiskey was launched, I guess, from our point of view, prematurely, and that Desiree's vision for Cardrona Distillery was to launch a whiskey that had spent at least 10 years in barrel. So the Cardrona single malt was not supposed to have been launched until 2025. The Just Hatched range, what we are tasting tonight, I should say, came out a little earlier. It's our expression that is 3 years in casks. At least. I'll show you the bottle here. This is what you're tasting tonight, Just Hatched. So really hasn't been out for long at all. We wanted to share the story with everybody, and this was a snapshot in time captured in bottle, showing you what 3 years was and is, and it was something to get excited about the adult whiskey to come. This event has fallen on the same week that we've bottled down our Growing Wings Solera, and you can see sort of this progression of our New Zealand native falcon growing into full maturity. But our 5-year Solera I bottled 2 days ago, and just seeing the progression ourselves is something that is really exciting, and it almost feels like we're now looking back at Just Hatched, which is kind of surreal.
Yeah, time flies, I suppose.
It really does.
So can you tell us a little bit about the whiskey that we're going to try today then? So the Just Hatched Solera.
Absolutely. So the Just Hatched Solera is an expression that must be at least 3 years old. The Solera for us was a marriage of select casks. Firstville Oloroso sherry butts married with bourbon. For this one here, we're looking mostly at Heaven Hill in terms of those ex-Kentucky bourbon casks. Because it was very much this sort of look in at where the whiskey was sitting, and it was important to us that it was a very honest representation of what's going on in the barrel at the time, So we decided to do all of our progress reports cask strength. So it is a half-size bottle that we present to market, but not a drop of water is added at bottling. What you have in front of you is 64.4, and you are more than welcome to taste it neat. I will never tell anyone how much water to add or what to mix with their whiskey. It is such a personal decision and preference. But a little splash of water will go a long way with this one in cooling down the heat of the alcohol and opening it up. I have poured a little splash myself. It is 10 a.m. and I'm sure I can join you. It'll be a great start to my day and a nice way for you to finish this incredible lineup that we have been walked through this evening. I've really enjoyed it. And so the whiskey, as we bring it to our nose.
Oh, snap.
Short snips. ABV. And please add water at your leisure, and I may add a splash to mine just yet. So what we're looking, it is tight. The nose is restricted by that alcohol, so you will get more from it as you add that water. It's sweet. Our new make spirit, I think comparatively from those that have tasted, is on the sweeter side. We do get this toffee, we get these beautiful oils that are long and creamy and inviting, and there's definitely fruit there. There is no peat. I guess in the making or the malting of the malt that we use, it is very much this sort of fruit-forward style that is elegant and inviting, and the fruit in the younger expressions has been very much swayed towards pear. There's this honey element that's almost floral, and as I'm starting to taste these older expressions, we're seeing that pear become more nectarine, snow fruit, thinking of winter already, and stone fruit as opposed to that kind of bright pear. So it is a sweet whiskey. It is subtle as you add that water, definitely a powerhouse at 64.4. And the oak is there, and it's quite almost disjointed. We're very much aware of the fact that this is a young expression, and the idea is that you get excited about what's coming and get excited about the potential of the malt while enjoying the process. So the oak is kind of almost clunky and behind that kind of quite sweet new make spirit. Well, we can say whiskey now, over 3 years in casks.
Yeah.
Have you tasted it prior to this evening, Harry, or is this your first look in?
I think I tried this once quite a few months ago. I can't remember if it was this expression, but there was one or two more that I had tried in the whiskey bar I was in prior to joining the Dram team. So, but I have to say I don't really remember it from those times. So I'm very much looking forward to the refresher. I get a lot of that floral honey note, as you said. Like for me, that it's almost like Parma Violet. It's not quite as intense as that, but that's the sort of floral note I get from it, which is really great. And as someone else said in the comments, they wouldn't have guessed the ABV from the nose. I don't think I would guess that this was 64% either, to be honest. I think it's really deceptive in a good way.
Yeah, it doesn't need a lot of water to open up, which is fantastic. It is an inviting whiskey, and adding just a splash will allow you to enjoy it that little bit more, but it's not one that with that high ABV that you need to add a lot to really enjoy and experience. It's a great call.
So you told me earlier as well that you had quite an interesting story getting into Cardrona, where you were actually planting some flower beds at the beginning of your time there. So can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up to work in such a beautiful distillery?
Yeah, absolutely. My, I guess, entry into the whiskey industry came via wine. So not a huge amount of disconnect. There's still that alcohol element, that sort of love of fermentation. I studied viticulture and winemaking and left high school and went straight into that degree, knowing that that was something that I was interested in doing, not because I was a big wine drinker in high school, but because alcohol to me is this kind of beautiful collaboration of creativity and science, and that's been referenced already this evening, and that's something that I wholeheartedly agree with. The science is necessary to create a consistent and clean product, but the creativity and that kind of having your own personal stamp on something and putting it in a bottle to be shared, I think is really a great way to spend your life and your time. And we have a lot of fun here. We recognize that we are, we're making spirits, and they should be fun, and it should be a good time. So it was an early decision to get into winemaking with the hopes that it would be a great way to see the world. I thought it would really be a ticket to the world, and it was. From university, I travelled extensively in winemaking, and it was on a stint home in between harvests that I came back to New Zealand and to Wanaka, this incredible playground that we live in, and a distillery was being built. And that was my first, this was actually the first distillery I'd ever been to. Spirits had not really caught my eye other than a little bit of work and pouring and serving them in hospitality. And so I really did get the crash course, and I haven't looked back. I love the buzz, the year-round buzz of spirit production. I love being part of a new company that every day is different, and we're always pushing for continuous improvement and growing a brand and our story. And the story is such an incredible one to tell. Our founder started this place from scratch. She's an incredible woman, and I feel very privileged to work with her. But my start here really was just hey, this is being built along the road. Went along for a conversation. They had their team in place, so I actually missed the initial commissioning of the stills and joined the distillery team a couple of months in to production. But it was a coffee with the manager. I left with I put in my size for my uniform, and I haven't looked back. They hired their team earlier than what was probably necessary for the opening of the business, so it was still a building site, and I spent the first month digging in the irrigation for the roses that surround us. There is perhaps a potential to make a perfume one day here on site, but I got on the other end of a shovel and dug in all the irrigation, and then we were inside helping out electricians and plumbers and sweeping building dust and doing whatever we needed to do to get the place open to the public. So that was 2000.
Very hands-on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's no other way. You've got to. Everyone's got to muck in. Absolutely.
I'm definitely getting a lot of that coca dust kind of note on the palate. Not so much on the nose, but definitely coming through. Just like a rich, when you open up a pack of hot chocolate, that aroma comes through for me now as well.
Yeah. Lots of oak character. Absolutely. You're right.
We've got a couple of people saying also elderflower, which is a good call as well, I think there. A background of aniseed and tarragon as well. So obviously something very perfumed about this whiskey.
Lovely tasting notes. Elderflower does grow wild in the valley, so that's definitely something that sort of springs to mind when we look at our spirits. We do make an elderflower liqueur based off a barley white spirit as well. So it's definitely a smell and taste that we're familiar with and enjoy here.
There we go. Fantastic. Well, we are getting towards the end of our stream now, so I would like to invite all of our wonderful tasting guests back, just for if you've been saving up any burning questions, now will be your time to ask them. I know there were one or two that we were going to come back to, so I hope you've all now tasted all of your whiskies, and let's invite our tasting guests back if we can. Thank you guys so much for staying on the line and for joining us again. A couple of you I think might still be muted, but that's okay. If you want to just jump in if there are any questions, please do. So there was one from a while ago that I saw. I'm just going to go back up. Liz asks, she said, okay, ladies, a question for later. And if any of you guys feel like you want to jump in, I don't think it's directed at anyone in particular. She asks, what is a traditional entry point for this industry? And maybe for some of you who have passion but came to it late, what stopped you earlier? Great question. Maybe let's direct that first at Annabelle.
Well, I'm definitely a latecomer on this, and what stopped me is probably also a late coming to whiskey. So that's a fairly easy answer. I would say that in terms of roots in, our team are really have a really diverse range of backgrounds. We actually only have 2 people that have come from the whiskey industry. So I think honestly, you can come in from wherever you want. And I think we've heard lots of stories like that this evening. We actually run an internship every summer in non-COVID times for 2 women to come and do work experience for a week at the distillery for people to kind of test it out and get a better idea of it and understand actually what roles there are within the whiskey industry. Because I think that can be quite confusing to people from the outside, like, what do I actually want to do? But I think honestly, if you're interested, it's such a friendly industry. I'd also just encourage you to approach people and ask, because they'll generally be really helpful and it might help you figure out where you want to go.
There you go. Times like this, your perfect opportunity to ask those questions. Great. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that? What is a traditional entry point for the industry? And maybe for some of you who had passion but came to it late, what stopped you earlier?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. The lovely thing about the industry is that if you have a passion for it, if you're a regular person, like in terms of a consumer of whiskey, who works in IT or works in retail or works wherever you work, if you have an interest in the industry, pretty much every single person in the industry would be happy to give you a chance and give you a go. And it's literally a case, and I'm not kidding you, for the smaller businesses, whatever about the big guys, but like for the smaller businesses, just popping a note to somebody on social media, which is basically the way everyone communicates now anyway, to say, look, I'm really looking to get into it. Can you spare an hour of your time or whatever? And somebody will know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. It's a very familial industry because it is the drinks industry, and more specifically, it's the whiskey industry, which is even better. You know, it's better than vodka. So people will always help, and they'll be willing to help. So just reach out to me. I'm on Instagram. All the amazing women here on Instagram, or all the rest of it, will absolutely try to help, because I've only ever hired. Like Annabelle, like I've hired people who had no experience in the industry at all, zero. But they just had a real desire for it and love for it. And that's the kernel that you need to get into it in the beginning.
Great comment. Yeah, that passion is so much more important, I think, than just knowing things about whiskey, for sure. We have another question for Annabelle here this time, from Amy. She asks, I've heard comments that your whiskey is made for women due to its softer style and branding. What would you say to those people?
I would say that we don't make it for women. We make it for everyone. We definitely do aim for a softer style, but that's not necessarily because we're aiming for women. That's just what I like, but I am a woman, so maybe there's something
coincidence
going
then.
on there. Yeah, exactly. And you know, we are a female-led and predominantly female team, although we have lots of great men in the team as well, and that probably has influenced the branding, but it's not like we set out to be a female whiskey or anything like that. So I hope that's just what you get when you get diversity in the industry. You get a range of output and different ways of thinking about things. But that's also true to get a range of output from like a different way of thinking about anything. It's not, you know, it's not just the style or anything else. And I think the fact that a lot of our team aren't from the traditional whiskey industry gives us a opportunity to think more creatively about all sorts of aspects of the business. So.
Yeah. Do you think part of that, those comments that you get there, might be due to the fact that obviously you're quite vocal about being a female-led distillery? And then I'd like to kind of flip that question and ask Laura McDonald. Tamnavulin is also, you know, you've got a lot of females making the whiskey, but it's not something that gets, you know, talked around that much in the whiskey industry. So do you think, you know, is there something to maybe not talking about it so much? Like, is it quite is it negative that people are saying that about the whiskey? You know, what are your opinions on that question?
I'm happy to jump in here. I suppose when we're making whiskey, we're not necessarily just thinking about any particular type of consumer. It's all entirely flavour led, and it's also, you know, it's dependent on what we're working on at that moment in time. So if you maybe look at like maybe Tamnavulin's back catalogue, while it was silent, it did produce whiskey for a long period of time. You'll find that the style is pretty consistent. I don't think not talking about it is at any great detriment. It's certainly not for any deliberate reason, and perhaps, yeah, it's absolutely something we should celebrate more. But in terms of the whiskey itself, all entirely flavour led.
Thank you. Yeah. Cara asks, for every/anyone, so if anyone has any specific feelings on this, in talking with women consumers, what has surprised you about the way they approach whiskey? What has excited you? Maybe Laura from Penderyn, if you wanted to take this one.
Yeah, sure. So I think what surprised me is that you kind of have the perception that women maybe won't want to try whiskey or won't want to try whiskey, or if they do want to try whiskey, they'll only want to try it as a mixed drink. And it was certainly really refreshing to me when I was new to the industry that women actually they just want to try it in the same way that men do. I think because a lot of the marketing, and thankfully it's moved on quite a lot now, because a lot of the marketing has historically been targeted towards men. So you can kind of have this perception that women don't really want to try whiskey just as it is, just as it comes. So what really surprised me back then was that women do want that. And what has really excited me is that over the last couple of years, when I've been at trade shows or I've been at tasting events and that kind of thing, it's often women who are pushing the creativity. They're asking for something different. They're very, the women that I've met at these tastings, they know their own mind. They know what they're looking for, and they've got some really great ideas. And can you try this? Can you try that? What about this finish? What about that? And that's really exciting for me to see that the industry as a whole will be, it can be put forward by the views of women going forward. I find that really exciting.
Thank you. Yeah. One last one for Louise there again. You mentioned about whiskey and casks being too reactive. What does this, a bit more of a technical one really, what does this mean and how do you know?
So there's when you put whiskey in a cask, obviously there's a number of, and you're maturing, there's lots of different things that go on. There's extractive maturation, there's interactive maturation, there's environmental maturation. And when it comes to extractive maturation, it just basically means that the whiskey is seeping into the wood and seeping out of the wood and seeping into the wood, kind of in alignment with barometric pressure and with temperature and that kind of thing. And if you have really kind of fresh bourbon casks that are first fill bourbon casks, right? So they're going to be new American oak casks that probably have had bourbon in them for maybe about 3 years. So if you look at a stave, a 3-year-old bourbon it won't go that far into the stave, and then after that you just have raw wood, which is full of like all these mad wood sugars. So what that means is, really specifically, if you have a grain that is very, very conducive to soaking in flavor from the wood, more so than a malt. In our case, we had casks that were very fresh. They hadn't had bourbon in them for a huge amount of time prior. So the whiskey started to like soak into the staves, into the fresh wood part, and you start to get oaky, woody, tannic flavors that you don't really want over the long term. If I want lovely kind of fruity flavors in the Hansen, for example. I don't need tannins and I don't need leather and things like that. So you have to take out that particular grain and put it into a second fill bourbon, and then you put in some new make grain into that. Like the thing about a cask is that like it gives less and less and less every year. And you have to kind of really monitor that to make sure that you're putting the right whiskey in and taking the right whiskey out. If I can really sum it up quickly, it's just that like if you have a really fresh cask, you can't leave the whiskey in there for too long, or it'll just be too tannic for what we're after.
Great explanation, thank you. We'll sneak one last question in. I'm aware that we've run slightly late, but it's just been absolutely fantastic speaking to you guys. So one last question from Amy. This one is for Jill. She asks, you've been in the industry for a while. Do you feel change within the profile of whiskey drinkers? If so, has there been a watershed moment, or has it been more of a gradual change?
I would say there is change. I don't know if I've seen a watershed moment in the industry specifically, but for me, I think my watershed moment was probably, I'm going to be very general with my comments here, but I used to go to a lot of whiskey festivals, and they used to be, the majority of the people going were guys, and occasionally there'd be one or two women interested in whiskey who'd gone, and then a number of like other halves who were brought along either as designated drivers or kind of just they were interested, and their partners were like, come and just have a look at things. My watershed was when I was at I cannot remember the name, and it's the huge one in London, the Whiskey Exchange show in September, and there were hen-dos of women going, excited because the bride-to-be was like a huge whiskey fan, and she was like, come and join me with other women. And I love it because it's like everyone was like lifting each other up, and some of the girls were like, I don't like whiskey, and they were on the gin, and no one was being like, oh, gin's for girls. Everyone was just like, do you like that? That's all you need. And that for me was so great, because for years I didn't think I liked whiskey, and I was always being like, oh, why don't you just have a nice wee rum and coke? That'll be nice for you. And to suddenly have like other women being like passionate about whiskey to their friends was something I'd never seen. I loved it. But I think there is a big change, and Amy's obviously a huge kind of like push in the industry as being like a woman who runs an amazing whiskey club. There are amazing women like whiskey distillers we've got on tonight. We've got so many peers in the industry who are women and who are making their mark. And I can't remember who said it, but like when you're seen, when you see someone, you feel seen. And I'm sure that a lot of people will see women tonight talking about whiskey and think maybe that is something that they could be interested in too. So these are the watershed moments, I think, that are really driving the industry forward. So yeah, I'm really lucky.
Really fantastic comments there. Thank you, Jill. Yeah, definitely echoes, I think, a lot of what I'm feeling too. So yeah, thank you. So I'd just like to say again, another massive thank you to all of our tasting guests that have been with us tonight, and for taking time out of their evenings to talk to us about whiskey, to talk to us about life as a woman in the whiskey industry as well, and about their distilleries too. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have as well. So thank you again so much for joining us. I will just take a moment to remind you all as well. As I'm sure you already noticed, and Chris has been very diligent in putting it in the comments, but this whole box is obviously in honor of International Women's Day, which is just passed on Monday. Not only that, we're also donating all the proceeds from the sales of the box. So if you've joined us tonight and you don't yet have your whiskey box, don't fear, because it's still available throughout March, so you can still get one. If you have already, then we will be donating all the proceeds to 2 charities. So one of those is the Drinks Trust, and the other is Bristol Women's Voice, which is local to the Dram Team offices in Bristol. So we also have a donation page. If you wanted to make an additional donation, that's all going to go straight to those 2 charities. I think Chris just put it in the comments as well. So thank you very much for that. If you wanted to go and make a donation, you can do so there. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure, I have to say. And I've greatly enjoyed just the sheer variety of flavors that we've got to try today. So thank you again. It's been great.
Thank you for making it happen. Like these are the watershed moments. Like they're really important. There's so many of us in whiskey, and let's keep celebrating. So thank you for making it happen, and an honor to be on the stage with all of you great ladies.
Yeah, second. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.